Snow crunched under her boots as he opened the door, glanced at her and said, "I thought you'd be younger." Then he turned and walked away, leaving the door open. But not for her. The wind hit her face, and her heart sank, like the world was telling her, one more time, you don't belong here. But what happened next will stun even those who thought they'd seen it all. First, let's go back to the beginning. Margaret Whitlow stood in the stillness of the schoolroom, her fingers tracing the worn groove along the edge of her desk, the very spot where generations of children had once fidgeted, whispered, dreamed. The morning light, filtered through frost-laced panes, painted everything in a brittle silver. Dust hung like memory in the air, unmoved by the breeze that never came. The bell had rung earlier, out of habit, she supposed, though there were no feet to shuffle in response. No wool coats hung on pegs, no lunch pails clattering against wooden floors. The school had fallen silent in more ways than one, and now, with the district shutting it down for good, silence was all that remained. She walked slowly down the aisle between desks, each one a tiny ghost of voices and names, Jamie Miller's drawings carved into the wood, Annie Tompkins's initials carefully scratched beside a heart. Her shoes creaked against the floorboards as she reached the front of the room. There, the blackboard still bore the fading chalk lines of her final lesson. To everything, there is a season. That verse had stayed with her since Paul's funeral. She'd chosen it for the service, spoken it with trembling lips in front of neighbors who hadn't known what else to say to a woman who'd lost both husband and purpose in one spring. He had passed quietly in his sleep, as if worn out by the rhythm of a world too fast and too loud. Margaret had awoken to cold sheets, to a stillness she couldn't name, and everything after that had been a series of farewells, slow, unseen, relentless. The house had grown quieter in his absence. A clock ticking became thunderous, the stove's hiss a lament. She had begun to fear the sound of her own breath, as though it reminded her she was still here when so much of her life had already gone. And then, the letter arrived. Not with a knock or a stamp, but slid beneath her door in the hush of dawn. The handwriting was unfamiliar, firm, spare, like the man himself would prove to be. A rancher, a niece and a nephew in need of a teacher, her name remembered through the fragile thread of gratitude, the town clerk, long grown, still carrying the echo of her kindness. The letter offered more than employment. It offered a place in a story that hadn't ended yet. She pressed it to her chest, trembling not from cold, but from the unfamiliar weight of possibility. For the first time in many months, her breath fogged the window not in sorrow, but in quiet wonder. Maybe, just maybe, she was not yet finished. The Callahan ranch stood against the wind like an old man against time. Weathered, unmoving, unapologetically alone. It wasn't the kind of place that welcomed visitors. It endured them. Snow clung to the fences like a second skin, and the trees behind them drooped under the weight of winter, their limbs curled in on themselves like grief that couldn't speak. The house rose from the earth with a kind of reluctant dignity, broad, timbered, and silent, its chimney issuing a single thread of smoke that twisted skyward as if reluctant to leave. Everett Callahan answered the door with the posture of a man always interrupted. He was taller than she'd pictured, lean, his face carved more by silence than by age. His eyes flicked over her the way one might assess a stack of hay. Useful, maybe, if it held up. When he said, "I thought you'd be younger." It wasn't cruel. It was worse. Indifferent. He pointed down a hallway, muttered something about quilts, and walked off without looking back. The room she entered smelled faintly of cedar and dust, a square of quiet with a narrow bed, a small window, and nothing else. The wallpaper had long since surrendered to time. The floor creaked under her boots. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding her breath as if waiting for the house to breathe back. It didn't. She first saw the children in the barn, standing like statues beside a skittish pony. Caleb had straw in his hair and sadness in his shoulders. June's mittens were too big for her hands and didn't match. Their eyes were too old for their faces. Margaret introduced herself softly, not as a teacher, but as someone who wouldn't ask questions just yet. They didn't speak, but they listened. That was something. Inside, the house remained cold in spirit, even as heat radiated from the stove. Everett came and went like a man fulfilling obligations etched in stone. He didn't ask if she was comfortable, didn't thank her when she made stew for supper. He nodded. Sometimes. And only once did she catch him watching as she wiped June's mouth gently with a napkin, the way mothers used to. At night, alone in her narrow bed, Margaret cried with the discipline of someone who had long since stopped expecting comfort. The sobs were brief, bitten back, buried in wool. But in the morning, she dressed with precision, like a soldier. Her gray hair was brushed, her dress smooth. At the small table, she opened Little Women and began to read aloud by lantern light, even when no one sat across from her. And still the children came, not for the book, but for her voice. It was not warmth that kept her there, but the weight of unspoken things, and the fragile way a child's gaze can make a person stay rooted in unfamiliar soil. The rhythm of winter was slow and deliberate on the Callahan Ranch, a cadence made not of hours, but of tasks. Feeding the animals, tending the fire, clearing paths through knee-deep snow. Days slipped past in a quiet procession, indistinguishable save for the subtle changes in how people occupied the same silence. Between Margaret and Everett, that silence shifted. Not broken, but softened, like a long frozen creek beginning to murmur beneath the ice. At first, it was the firewood, stacked neatly by her door, always before sunrise. Then, a jar of plum preserves appeared on her windowsill, wrapped in a faded red cloth. No note, no explanation. When she thanked him over dinner, he only gave a short nod, his eyes fixed on his plate. But that nod, she realized, held more than courtesy. It held intention. The children noticed too. June's drawings, once hesitant sketches in the margins of old newspapers, became full pages of blooming flowers and horses mid-gallop. Caleb began volunteering to read aloud during lessons, his voice faltering at first, then steadying with each chapter. Margaret watched them from behind her teacup, her heart tightening in that aching, grateful way love sneaks in, not loudly, but with the quiet insistence of sunlight through frost. And at night, when the house exhaled into stillness, and the world outside disappeared beneath a sky of bitter stars, Margaret sewed. Her fingers moved with memory, not just skill. One square for each day that felt worth remembering. There were deep reds for laughter, soft grays for longing, golds for the light in June's eyes when she showed her a drawing. She stitched in silence, letting the past pass through her, the scent of chalk dust in a warm classroom, the sound of Paul's humming while he carved wood in the back room, the echo of children's voices spelling out words for the first time. The blizzard came without warning, a wall of white that shut out the world and locked the four of them in a bubble of breath and fire. That evening, the power flickered once, then went out. Everett lit a lamp and poured 2 cups of coffee, his movements unhurried, his presence quieter than the storm outside. He sat across from her and said nothing for a long while. Then, "Why'd you come here, really?" His voice wasn't suspicious. It was bare, like he was asking something of himself just as much. Margaret set her thread aside, looked at him, not through him. "Because," she said, "no one needed me anymore. Until maybe you did." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something unspoken and unmistakable. And when Everett smiled, small, fleeting, but real, it landed in the room like spring's first thaw. Not loud, but enough to believe in what might follow. The thaw came not with grandeur, but in slow, patient gestures. A drip from the eaves, the subtle shift in birdsong, crocuses piercing the last crusts of snow with delicate defiance. The earth softened underfoot, and with it, so did everything else. Even the silence between Everett and Margaret began to bloom. Less of a gap now, more of a thread gently pulling them together. When Everett mentioned a picnic, it came without ceremony. He didn't look at her when he asked, didn't phrase it as a question. Just said gruffly, "Sunday might be warm enough." And that was that. Margaret understood the meaning buried in the words. Not a date, not a declaration, but an opening. A breath held and released. She wore her best shawl that day, stitched with faded violets, her hair pinned up in the way Paul used to admire, though she hadn't worn it like that in years. The pie she brought was apple, slightly oversweetened, but made with care. Everett arrived with his shirt pressed stiff and his collar tugged once in visible discomfort. He looked like a man trying not to impress, but to honor the occasion. That meant more. They sat beneath the cottonwoods, whose branches still bore the pale green uncertainty of early spring. The children chased butterflies in the tall grass, June's laughter ringing clear like wind chimes. Caleb, more reserved, had taken to building a fort with twigs. Everett and Margaret said little. But when he reached into the basket and pulled out the folded quilt, her heart paused. She had stitched it in silence over the long nights of winter, a tapestry of her past, sewn from the shirts Paul used to wear in summer, the hem of her wedding dress, the curtains from her first classroom. It was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but it was honest, and when Everett ran his calloused fingers across the seams, he touched it like scripture. Like each square carried something holy. At the town's spring dance, held in the Grange Hall trimmed with wildflowers and lanterns, Everett took her hand. Not quietly, not in the corner, in front of everyone. The music swelled, and he pulled her close. They danced slowly, his hand firm, hers trembling only at first. Whispers circled them like wind, but he didn't hear them, or didn't care. Under the soft golden lights, she wasn't old. She wasn't alone. She was exactly where she was meant to be, no longer surviving a winter, but stepping into the quiet warmth of something new. And later, under a sky brushed with stars and the scent of thawed earth, he looked at her, not as someone rescued, but as someone recognized. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You're better." She didn't blush, didn't look away, just smiled the way only someone who's reclaimed herself can. "You didn't save me, Everett. You just reminded me I was never lost." The stars hadn't changed. But for the first time in a long while, they no longer looked distant. They looked like home.